Chapter 12. The Nature of the State. After having examined the principalities and powers and the scope and purpose of government, we must now examine the state for what it is in truth. By examining the true nature of the state, thereby exposing it as chief among the principalities, I hope to begin the destruction of the state's mythical meta-narrative, thereby causing Christians to reconsider their involvement in the state. This must be our goal even if the state has a legitimate role to play in God's creation, for it remains a power in rebellion, malignant and evil, lying under the power of the evil one. However, some will insist that they benefit greatly from the state's actions and argue that the state is an unqualified good. When we benefit from the state as it fulfills God's mandate, we are indeed blessed. But to the extent that we benefit from its self-interested actions and oppression of others, we are not blessed. Neither is the state declared a good and virtuous entity because we so benefit. A little thought will clarify the matter. Consider a crime family. It is not uncommon that the family cares for its members, even sacrificially. Nor is it doubtful that the family derives great benefit from their criminal activity. There may be genuine camaraderie. The leader, mothers, and fathers within the family may treat their children well. But would anyone call the crime family good because of the benefit they derive from their criminal activity? The answer is obvious. Consider next a state, for example, Germany from 1933 to 1945. Germany was devastated by the vengeful Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. German society was collapsing as its financial institutions disintegrated and various communist factions endeavored to bring down the government. In this chaos, Adolf Hitler rose to power and brought national pride, stability, and growth back to the nation. Yes, it was true that some were treated poorly, Jews, the infirm, communists, but the vast majority benefited greatly from Hitler's actions. When Hitler moved into the Rhine industrial region and when he annexed part of Czechoslovakia and partitioned Poland in the name of Lebensraum, many supported him, believing that his activities to enlarge the German Empire to their benefit was desirable and warranted. They considered themselves a great people after all. Earlier, Britain did the same thing when they took over India and much of the Middle East. Their empire was so large that the sun never set on it. But does anyone really believe that the German government was anything but evil during this era, even if it benefited most German people? Was Britain an unqualified good as it raped India and controlled great swaths of the world? Of course not. Just because a nation's actions benefit its citizens, or some large subset within it, does not make the nation a positive good. Consider further the United States of America. Americans, in the main, are the freest and most wealthy of all peoples. This is believed not only by Americans, but by the millions who have immigrated to the U.S. to benefit from and participate in this freedom and abundance. But is America, especially in God's eyes, an unqualified good? Can a Christian wholeheartedly throw in with the nation and support it, and by their actions secure its ends? And just what are America's desired ends? America's sins are well known. Black slavery, the American Civil War, the American Indian genocide that lasted into the early 20th century, justified by our belief in manifest destiny, its abuses in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, the killing of millions of civilians in World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the recent Middle Eastern wars and many others? In spite of and because of all these actions and many more, the vast majority of Americans have genuinely benefited. If we are willing to apply the same logic we use to evaluate the crime family and the German nation, then we must conclude that not even the United States can be considered good. America's manifest destiny was just as evil as Germany's Lebensraum, and America's murder of millions of innocent German and Japanese women and children from 30,000 feet was just as evil as Germany's killing of innocent civilians on the ground in prison camps. Many more comparisons could be made. In any case, it is clear that even the U.S. lies under the power of the evil one. Christians do not use, must not use, the degree to which they benefit from a nation's activities as a relevant criterion to evaluate that nation. Instead, we must see the state for what it is in truth and use God's standards when weighing the state in the balance. With this in mind, let us take off our rose-colored glasses and take a hard look at the state and see it for what it is. But let us first see what God thinks of the state. Section 12.1, a scriptural view of the state. Section 12.1.1, establishment of the Jewish state. The first book of Samuel records the establishment of the Jewish monarchy. Generally, most view this as a positive event. However, the biblical record looks at it quite differently. The story begins with Samuel, Israel's last judge. Samuel, in his old age, appointed his two sons, Joel and Abijah, to assume his judgeship over Israel. Unfortunately, his sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. Knowing this, Israel's elders requested that he appoint them a king to judge them, like all the nations. Samuel is disturbed by this and prays to God. God's reply is surprising. Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from the land of Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them. In asking for a king, they have rebelled against God, and yet God gave them their desire. God's response contains four important aspects. 1. In their request, they have rejected God's rule. 2. They are continuing in the rebellion they have persisted in since leaving Egypt. 3. God likens their request to idolatry. 4. They are to be warned about the king's abuses. The establishment of the monarchy is occasioned on rebellion, an act of idolatry. Nevertheless, God in his mercy will work it for good and glorify himself. With his heart surely broken, Samuel speaks to this rebellious people God's words concerning their king. In so doing, he provides a penetrating insight into the nature and actions of the state. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, "This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. Sadly, Israel will regret having asked for a king, but God will not hear them when they cry out to God to deliver them from the king's oppression. These rebellious people will have to live with their decision. Despite this warning, the people insist on a king. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." If we cast this passage in more modern categories, we find that the king will glorify himself at their expense, will organize the people and use them for his ends, will implement forced labor and slavery, will act corruptly and confiscate their wealth and give it to his favorites and supporters, will extract burdensome taxation, will use the people for his ends, and in the end all will become his servants, resulting in tyranny. In summary, the king will enslave, exploit, oppress, manipulate, act corruptly, as well as corrupt his subjects and exalt himself at the expense of his subjects. This could easily have begun with the modern state will. Unfortunately, most who call themselves Christians seem to make the same demand, for they will not have the Messiah rule over them, but insist that there shall be another king over them, that they may be like the nations. God's description of the Jewish monarchy and history demonstrates the reality that the state's desire is to exalt itself, enrich itself, extend its rule and power, and ensure its continued existence, that is, build the state, and to do so by any and all means. The state's first and only interest is always self-interest. Looked at another way, the state insists on complete autonomy. Autonomy not only from God's rule, but even from being informed by God or any other power except that of superior worldly power, that is, another nation that defeats it. This autonomy has only grown worse since the Renaissance and the subsequent Enlightenment. During these movements, man's insistence on autonomy from God and other men gathered momentum, and today man's desire for autonomy is fully birthed. And so, as man has become autonomous, so have his institutions become autonomous. As man made himself the measure of all things, so his institutions have become the measure of all things. As man assumed this autonomy, making himself a god, so his institutions have presumed to be gods. The modern nation-state is the culmination of this deification and enslaves all mankind. Has any state ever chosen to limit itself? Has any state acted altruistically? Has any state willingly subordinated itself to another entity? Do states live in mutual submission? These are impossibilities, for the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. The state is narcissism writ large. It exists for itself. Despite claims to the contrary, its actions reveal its true character and intention. Thus, the only limits the state recognizes are those forced on it. those limits it cannot ignore. These limits are placed on it by other states, the inevitable laws of mathematics and finance, as it suffers the consequences of financial irresponsibility and the revolt of its citizens. However, even though it denies the spiritual realm, God has final say in all matters in heaven and on earth, even if he lets Satan rule the nations for a season. Section 12.1.2. God's view of the state. In addition to the passage in 1 Samuel 8, several other Old Testament passages provide additional insight into God's view of the state. The first is found in Isaiah. Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are regarded as a speck of dust on the scales. Behold, he lifts up the islands like fine dust. Even Lebanon is not enough to burn, nor its beasts enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are regarded by him as less than nothing and meaningless. He it is who reduces rulers to nothing, who makes the judges of the earth meaningless. Scarcely have they been planted, scarcely have they been sown, scarcely has their stock taken root in the earth, but he merely blows on them, and they wither, and the storm carries them away like stubble. The passage speaks for itself. God has no regard for the nations. For all their pomp and glory, their power and rage, the nations amount to nothing more than a sideshow compared to what God is doing in and through his people. The last passage provides insight into the nation's ultimate end and the attitude of the nations toward God and his Son. Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he may not become angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. All the nations rage against God, refusing to submit to his will and commands. For them, God's rule and commands are fetters and cords, constraining their lusts for glory, power, and wealth. This is true even of the best of them. But God in heaven laughs at them. He holds them in derision, and his Son will break them and receive them as an inheritance. Although not directly employed to describe the state, Romans chapter 3 describes the world outside Christ in the most evil and malevolent terms, and in some ways picks up where Psalm 2 ends, describing more fully the nation's rage. There is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Given the witness of history, who can doubt that the nations do not seek God, that they always keep on deceiving, that their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness, that they are swift to shed blood, that destruction and misery are in their paths, that they have not known the way of peace, and that they do not fear God? This passage accurately describes mankind and his institutions. Despite this, men insist on glorifying their nation and its history. Most men see history moved forward by the great nations, believing that truly meaningful change is brought about by the nations, that the historical thread to follow is the thread left by the nations. Nothing could be further from the truth, for the nations are as nothing before God and less than meaningless as they rage against the Father and the Son. The truly important thread in history is the scarlet thread God has woven into our world as he has worked out his redemptive plan through his people, a people who were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection, those who were mocked and scourged, chained and imprisoned, those who were stoned, sawn in two, tempted, put to death with the sword, and those who went about in sheepskins, in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, those who wandered in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. It is with God and his people, and it is his work through them that is crucial to the world. The nations are nothing, and the Christian wastes his time building them. Section 12.2. The state's assumptions and tendencies. Section 12.2.1. General principles and assumptions. Self-interested and self-justified. We have already pointed out that the state operates on the principle of self-interest, and it employs every possible means to secure its continued existence. Being the very picture of narcissism, it is at the center of its universe. The state also justifies itself. It assumes that its means and ends are proper and virtuous. It is unable to criticize itself and subject itself to an unfavorable judgment, believing that whatever it desires or does is good and proper. No limits. The state also believes that no limits should be placed on it. Believing thus, it is always trying to find ways around legal restrictions of its power, becoming very creative as it attempts to rid itself of these limitations. In America, consider the manipulations of the judiciary to be able to legislate from the bench and subvert the Constitution, and extend federal power by reinterpreting the Commerce Clause. Examples from America alone are legion. Some men, at times, try to limit the state, but they are ultimately unsuccessful, for the inevitable tendency is growth without limit. It is a law obeyed by all governments, as certain as the conservation of energy and that gravity pulls all things toward the center of the earth. Unlimited claims on its subjects. The state presumes to make any demand on time, property, and life of its subjects to achieve its relative goods. Consider the oath of allegiance to the United States of America, required of all who desire to become naturalized citizens. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen, that I will support and defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I will bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by the law, that I will perform non-combatant service in the armed forces of the United States when required by the law, that I will perform work of national importance under civilian direction when required by the law, and I will take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, so help me God. This oath reveals the state's pretensions. The American state insists that we cannot be a citizen of any other kingdom, that our allegiance be singular, and that we must defend it and the Constitution even with our lives in war if necessary. It also presumes to force us to work for it as it sees fit. It makes an unlimited claim on our life and labor. It presumes to be God. If Jesus is a real king of a real kingdom that exists now for his people who operate under an ethical system radically different from those of all other kingdoms, then this oath is rather problematic, to say the least. Assumes unlimited capability. The assumption of unlimited capability is common to all states, but it reaches astronomical heights in socialist and communist states, which include the United States, as it becomes more of a socialist state rather than a limited democratic republic. These states presume to care for every need and remove the natural consequences for bad choices and evil behavior, thereby utterly enslaving those who embrace these demonic systems. Section 12.2.2 Tendencies. Accumulation of wealth and power. The state's natural tendency is to accumulate wealth and power to increase its glory, extend its control, and ensure its continued existence. In contrast, Israel kings were forbidden to accumulate wealth and multiply power, and even numbering the people was sinful. God deliberately limited the state's power and its ability to grow by placing limitations on the king and economically encumbering the nation by the Sabbath and Jubilee years. Centralizes power. The state centralizes power. From a purely utilitarian perspective, this is natural since centralization makes things easier to manage. However, it does not necessarily mean that things run better. On the contrary, as power is centralized, there is a greater opportunity and inclination to use power for its own benefit. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Corruption and the abuse of power are the inevitable consequences of the concentration of power. Jesus has forbidden his followers to exercise power over others and accumulate wealth, a sure way to accumulate power, for the simple reason that power is inevitably abused. In Jesus' kingdom, all are servants mutually submitted to one another. They do not exercise power over one another. Even among those who refuse to live in Jesus' kingdom, diffuse power is best. The nations operate best, and their people are freer, when power is distributed as diffusely as possible. It is almost axiomatic that some form of slavery always accompanies the centralization of power. Corruption and lawlessness. Corruption and lawlessness permeate the state, corruption and lawlessness being its favorite pastimes. Taking from its subjects to give to its friends and supporters is standard operating procedure. Ignoring the law is standard fare for the ruling elite. If you possess enough political power, are connected well enough, or possess enough wealth, the law generally does not apply to you. This evasion is done both in secret and openly. In America's case, legislators exempt themselves from the laws they impose on their subjects. Corruption in the form of cronyism and nepotism is chronic in all states. No state is exempt from this cancer that destroys its legal, moral, and social fabric. If history is a guide, no nation has, in its old age, survived its relentless advance and destruction. Oppression. The worst states oppress both their subjects and those of other nations. The best oppress few of their subjects or those of other nations. However, no state founded by man is guiltless of oppression. Even the monarchy in ancient Israel was guilty. Go back and read 1 Samuel 8 if you have forgotten God's prediction of the kingly abuses that would follow. Exploitation, enslavement, manipulation, oppression, and corruption are at the core of the principality and power we call the state. One can successfully argue that the United States of the past, probably the first 100 years of its existence, compared to all other nations, has brought the greatest liberty and wealth to its subjects. However, even this great nation, from its very inception, was guilty of horrible crimes against certain minorities living within its borders. The enslavement of the black man and participation in the slave trade were horrific and inexcusable. On a greater scale of evil, the United States waged a war of extermination against the indigenous American Indian population that continued into the early 20th century. America's oppression continues even now, but in more refined ways. How can a people claiming to be Christian engage in such activities? How could people claiming to be Christian affirm that such a nation is Christian? The truth is, they cannot. Their nation's fruit betrays its true nature. Some will immediately challenge this, saying that many have benefited from America, and they would be correct. But does the truth that many have benefited provide justification for the unqualified evil perpetrated by America? Is this logic any different from the logic the crime family uses to justify their actions? The only difference is that of scale. The United States, however, is in no way a singular evil, for examples of state oppression are more numerous than states. Limitless volumes could be written chronicling the oppression of Babylon, Assyria, Rome, Persia, Greece, India, Tsarist Russia, Communist Russia, Belgium, France, England, Germany, Denmark, China, and Japan. But should we be surprised that the state is characterized by oppression when God described the Jewish monarchy as oppressive? Or when he revealed that the nations rage against him? That those outside his kingdom are swift to kill? That they have not known the way of peace and are given over to evil? The way of peace they have not known. Although already mentioned, the following bears repeating. States do not know the way of peace. They instead multiply violence and war. History tells us that states are quick to employ violence both internally and externally. However, even if a state delays acting, at some point violence is sure to come. One would do well to ask, when has a state willingly chosen to endure an evil instead of avenging itself if it can? The exceptions are so few they prove the rule. Even the state that employs violence in self-defense finds itself no longer at peace, unable to avoid violence. Secrecy and deception. Secrecy, deception, and lies about its true intentions are all too common in all states. These practices are essential tools in its arsenal. Many argue that secrecy is necessary and prudent. In a limited sense, some level of secrecy may be needed, but deception is never legitimate. But the state's secrecy is more often employed to obfuscate the truth, even allowing the state to claim innocence when suffering an attack due to evil that it has done in the past. In reality, the attack was a result of clandestine activity and hidden crimes that goaded its present co-belligerent into taking action. The United States has organizations that are highly skilled in the sort of actions that cause these types of attacks. In particular, the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. military and its covert forces, such as the Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and others. It is also common that lies and secrecy are used by states to manipulate their subjects to prosecute war or frighten their subjects to cause them to relinquish freedoms for the sake of protection or for the sake of some social change the state wishes to impose on them. Secrecy and deception are so much a part of the state that it is impossible to imagine one operating without them. The state as a protection racket. Charles Tilly, in the article War Making and State Making as Organized Crime, provides considerable insight into the development and operation of the modern state. As the title indicates, the state is characterized as organized crime, in particular organized crime as a protection racket. Given the lawlessness of the state and its foundational principle of self-interest, this should not come as a surprise. For being organized and lawless, the state is thus rightly identified as organized crime. In his essay, Tilly recounts the development and operation of the modern European nation-state. However, much of what he presents is applicable to modern states that have arisen since in other parts of the world. The birth of the modern nation-state came about from the desire of European monarchs to consolidate the rule within their particular realm. It arose out of the natural tendency of the monarch to accumulate power. Although the modern nation-state did not spring out of any particular political theory, it did benefit greatly from the Enlightenment philosophy in general and political philosophy in particular. The people were given universal ideas, freedom, liberty, fraternity, etc., which permitted them to have a stake in the government. This coherent collective desire and action gave the modern state tremendous inertia and power. A whole nation could be mobilized to accomplish a single task. The monarch over a modern state did not have to rely on his mercenary army, but could access the human and material resources of the whole nation. For Tilly, modern states are relatively centralized, differentiated organizations, the officials of which more or less successfully claim control over the chief concentrated means of violence within a population inhabiting a large, contiguous territory. Tilly presents his argument thus. Power holders' pursuit of war involved them willy-nilly in the extraction of resources for war-making from the populations over which they had control, and in the promotion of capital accumulation by those who could help them borrow and buy. War-making, extraction, and capital accumulation interacted to shape European state-making. Power holders did not undertake these three momentous activities with the intention of creating national states, centralized, differentiated, autonomous, extensive political organizations. Nor did they ordinarily foresee that national states would emerge from war-making, extraction, and capital accumulation. Instead, the people who controlled European states and states in the making warred in order to check or overcome their competition, and thus to enjoy the advantages of power within a secure or expanding territory. To make more effective war, they attempted to locate more capital. In the short run, they might acquire the capital by conquest, by selling off their assets, or by coercing or dispossessing accumulators of capital. In the long run, the quest inevitably involved them in establishing regular access to capitalists who could supply and arrange credit, and in imposing one form of regular taxation or another on the people and activities within their spheres of control. Tilly goes on to integrate the notion of protection into his argument, a concept that is pertinent not only in the development of European states, but for all states. He rightly points out that protection may be understood in at least two ways. In the first, we have the comforting idea that the modern nation-state protects its subjects from internal and external threats. The internal threats are protected against by the law, the courts, and the police who enforce these laws. The external threats are protected against by the military and border police and the laws respecting international relationships. Obviously, this protection comes at a price which the state collects in taxes. In the second, more ominous sense, the state protects its citizens and requires they pay for it, whether they want it or not. It is in this sense that the state operates as a criminal protection racket, and it is in this sense that the state most frequently provides protection. This evil form of protection can come with an iron hand, fully in the open, but this seldom occurs in today's modern state. Now, criminal protection is usually foisted on the state's subjects by propaganda and by manipulating and controlling information and education. The first is now wrapped in soft, colorful felt, but the end result is the same, except that the people willingly embrace their state mafia. We observe the state's criminal form of protection in its preferential treatment of a specific class within the state, a class the state finds particularly helpful in establishing and extending its power. This protection typically takes the form of laws that favor this group or a particular activity, thereby giving it some tangible advantage over others, and often enriching the group or organization at the expense of its competitors. These preferred groups are incredibly diverse and consist of corporations, institutions, minorities, and majorities. In other words, any entity the state believes is particularly beneficial to its aims may be a recipient of its special protection. What entity is favored with greater protection depends on the current aims and interests of those at the state's helm, and may change even within the tenure of a single regime. An excellent contemporary example is racial preference seen in affirmative action in its many forms. Modern whites have been taught, through government schools, the media, corporate sensitivity training, and the like, that they were and are now responsible for whatever ails a particular minority group. By this training, most accept this institutionalized racism, and few complain that their taxes support this lie. Thus, a preferred group, the minority, from whom the state derives tremendous political power, being able to count on their vote, is provided greater protection against its competitors. This is a particularly egregious case of criminal protection, but it is not the only one. Any group, whites included, with access to power can and have run this racket. Another form of criminal protection imposed on all the state's subjects comes in at least two forms. In the first instance, the state desires to engage in an internal or external activity such as a war for reasons that it knows its subjects are unwilling to support. These reasons might be an opportunity that the leaders of the state see in extending their power, or acquiring new riches, or equivalently, obtaining access to new markets. The reason might also be based on a desire to protect banking interests from which the state benefits. This is often the case for the modern state requires free and ready access to the credit supplied by its bankers. It may also be the case that the state and its corporate interests, for example, military-industrial complex, see a financial windfall. If the beneficiaries of these actions can motivate the citizenry to fight for some unrelated high-minded reason like democracy or liberty so they can benefit, so much the better. In the second instance, the state may impose protection on its citizens as a consequence of blowback. Protection in this case is understood generally as military action against a foreign aggressor. Blowback is the term used to describe the violent actions of other states as a consequence of overt or covert foreign policy and covert military operations. In this case, foreign policy is often disguised, but nevertheless justified in the name of the people. Upon closer examination, we find it specious and founded on half-truths and outright deception. In the case of covert activity, the state's actions are deliberately hidden from its subjects to provide plausible deniability when the events spiral out of control as the foreign power strikes back in revenge. The protection described above is indeed like that provided by a criminal protection racket. However, it is far more insidious. The criminal syndicate does not hide that it is both the protector and the assailant. The state, on the other hand, by propaganda, control of information, manipulation of the culture through education and institutions and law, convinces the people that they truly need the state's protection, even though the need for protection was the result of its own evil activity. In this effort, they are so successful that most not only accept the state's justification for its actions, they also willingly sacrifice their wealth and lives for it. Willing acceptance of criminal protection has always been a problem, being common as states manipulated information and media to convince their subjects to fight wars not in their best interests. More examples exist, but the ability of the state to convince their subjects to willingly embrace criminal protection has reached new heights with socialism, communism, and capitalism. The advance of socialistic criminal protection is clearly visible in the United States. By propaganda, manipulating information, education, and other institutions, the state has progressively convinced its subjects that it can and should solve all man's problems. In its attempt to deliver on its claim, the state, being supremely incompetent, makes a mess of what it claims to fix. However, it is so skillful at dissembling that it not only avoids the blame it deserves, but it further convinces its subjects that with greater taxation and power in the form of new laws, it can solve the very problem it created. Failure followed by more taxation and legislation is a never-ending spiral, whereby the state enriches itself and its supporters at the expense of the governed, enslaving them, making them more and more reliant on the state, and as a consequence, more firmly establishing its power over them. Amazingly, the masses consistently take the state's lies hook, line, and sinker. P.T. Barnum's axiom seems even more true today. There's a sucker born every minute. Gullibility, or a dumbed-down population brought about by a wretched education system and continuous propagation, is not only the cause. However, for something else is at the bottom of this. The state is not what we want it to be, or what we perceive it to be. The state is what it actually is. And the truth of the matter is that the state is more like a criminal protection racket writ large, even if, among all its other lawless activities, it benefits its citizens by protecting them as God intends. The state is neither altruistic nor principally interested in providing protection for its subjects, even though it may, more or less, provide a proper measure of legitimate protection. The state is and always will be a fallen principality operating on self-interest, exploiting those within and without to enrich itself and extend its domain and control. Much more could be said on this. We could look at political philosophy and history. In particular, we could more closely examine the development of the state. This is important for our understanding of the state, since it shows that the state was not developed primarily for the establishment of liberty, but rose out of the desire for those in control to more effectively extend their power and enlarge their wealth. We would in such a study also find that the present form and structure of the state, any state, is not ordained by God any more than past forms of political structure. There is no God-ordained form of government. Such a study would be profitable, but beyond the scope of this work. Section 12.2.3. The State as God. The portrait above is real. It is not an exaggeration, but an honest characterization of the state through history, and it agrees with God's characterization of the state. The portrait reveals a narcissistic principality assuming omnipotence, willing to do whatever it takes to ensure its excellence and enlargement. It is the portrait of a self-made absolute. It is the portrait of a rebellious principality attempting to ascend to the very throne of God. For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Isaiah 14, verses 13 and 14. Section 12.3. The State and Oppression. Having mentioned that the state is characterized by oppression, let us consider more carefully the forms this oppression takes. The history of the state is the history of oppression, if not always for its subjects, then for those unfortunate enough to not be numbered among them. For there are always groups, either inside or outside the state, that suffer under it. Oppression can take many forms, both soft and hard, forms that are characteristic of different epochs and governments. Some of these forms are slavery, economic exploitation through force or manipulation of market and financial institutions, war, unfavorable or manipulated legal systems, second-class citizenship, both formal and informal, denial of access to markets, education, jobs, etc., denial of property ownership, denial of free speech, religious practice, association, travel, etc., manipulation of information, propaganda, overt lies, deception, secrecy, junk science, and manufactured consent. The list is endless. The subtle forms are truly insidious, for these are accomplished by warping reality so that the state can oppress with impunity. By this manipulation, the state induces its subjects to act in ways that do not truly benefit them, but rather advance the state's power and control. This can be seen in its manipulation of the public to induce them to go to war, or adopt policies and laws that extend the state's power at the expense of their liberty. It is this form of oppression and control that is preferred among more modern and affluent states. In the United States, the Patriot Act, which was adopted after the 9/11 attacks, is such a move. The U.S. government used the fear generated by the attacks to implement sweeping unconstitutional surveillance. The TSA, which treats all those traveling by air as potential terrorists, employing intrusive searches as a matter of course. A similar expansion of state power and intrusion will predictably occur as the government uses the fear it has created by its overreaction to the coronavirus to remove more constitutional freedoms in the name of safety. In all these modern cases, Americans have willingly placed chains upon themselves. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. This is a quote attributed to Benjamin Franklin addressing the trade-off between safety and freedom. In the letter in which this appears, it is said that the manner in which I employ it takes the quote out of context. This may be the case, but it is nevertheless true. Not only do those who give up freedom to obtain safety not deserve them, they will not obtain them. Aldous Huxley, in his diabolical yet prophetic book, Brave New World, perfectly describes the state's ability to bring about self-enslavement. A really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. This form of oppression is accomplished by various means. To justify and gather support for war, the state tells overt lies and half-truths about its enemies. It frequently resorts to propaganda that dehumanizes their enemy, making it easier to hate and kill them. At the root of all this manipulation is the attempt to create a reality based on assumptions manufactured by the state to cause its subjects to behave in a manner suitable for its ends. In addition to outright lies, propaganda, and manipulation of information and education, we can now add junk science and its efforts to effect a new slave-like cultural reality based in radical environmentalism and its most successful scam, global warming, now called climate change. Those who benefit from the state are frequently just as oppressed and enslaved as the groups that are overtly oppressed. However, the former take their chains willingly. These are enslaved to a false god to do his bidding at their expense. Having internalized the state's mythical narrative, they willingly sacrifice their wealth and lives to advance the very entity that exploits them. They may indeed benefit from the state, but believing and living a lie, they are perhaps more horribly oppressed than others, for they forge their own chains and are unable even to see them. Oppression may also come from exploitation of one group occasioned on the corrupt practices of those in power. Taking wealth from one group and giving it to those the state favors is common. This theft may be the theft of labor, as is done with slaves, or it may be done by taxation, intentional inflation, or deceitful banking practices. These last three practices have recently been fine-tuned by our governments and bankers. In the old European monarchies, these beneficiaries were noblemen, soldiers, religious leaders, and bankers. Today, the beneficiaries may be state bureaucracies, corporations, minority groups, and, of course, bankers. The state may vigorously assert its altruistic motives, but no such pure motives ever exist. Any group the state believes supports and extends its power and control becomes a recipient of these stolen goods. Socialism, a modern form of wealth transference, is extremely adept at oppressing. It oppresses both the one from whom wealth has been taken and the recipient of this wealth who is enslaved by the government's largesse. It also is coercive of civil society and personal responsibility, all the while enriching the ruling class and enlarging its power. Any economic system closely coupled to the state, as is socialism, can become oppressive, even capitalism. Furthermore, any economic system of any kind that becomes an end in itself will be oppressive. We will more closely examine the techniques of control employed by both socialist and capitalist states in the next section.